Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. A historic summit marking 70 years of the South Korea and US Security Alliance. We find out how big a role Taiwan will play in its future. With me to discuss this are Andrea Yang, Democratic Progressive Party Deputy Secretary General, Alfred Lin, Kuomintang Spokesperson, and Marcin Jerzewski, European Values Center for Security Policy Taiwan Office Head and also an East Asia specialist. Andrea, Alfred, Marcin, very warm welcome to the show today.
Thank you.
South Korean President Yoon Suk-Yeol travelled to Washington on a state visit, the first to the US by a South Korean leader in 12 years. It was only the second state visit US President Joe Biden has hosted since taking office. It also marked the 70th anniversary of a partnership that has brought peace to Seoul while helping anchor US strategy in Asia. Yoon was seeking assurances on deterring North Korea, while Biden was looking for Seoul's support for US interests related to China and Russia.
During the meeting between the two leaders, President Biden highlighted that increasing cooperation was more than just a deterrent for North Korea.
We discussed our work together on promoting peace and stability in the Taiwan Straits, ensuring freedom of navigation in the South China Sea and beyond.
The U.S. has been boosting its military presence in Asia in light of China's increasingly aggressive actions in the region. Nations like Japan and South Korea are not only concerned about North Korea's actions, but also China's intentions with Taiwan.
In fact, one of South Korea's major shipping lanes directly transits through the Taiwan Strait. So we can see a clear relation between, Korean economic security, energy security, and the security and peace of Taiwan Strait.
James Lin and Jaime Ocon reporting. Marcin, if I can start with you. So we heard there how South Korea would be impacted in any Taiwan contingency. But first, China has objected to Yoon Suk-Yeol's Reuters interview, where he made a comparison between North and South Korea and Taiwan-China. What's your view about this comparison?
China continues to push a narrative in which it shapes the growing tensions in the Taiwan Strait and in general the Taiwan question altogether as an internal affair. And the tensions that we observe on the Korean Peninsula are much more internationalized. So already the format of interactions between Pyongyang and Seoul, such as the existence of two distinct states, the idea of one China, one Taiwan is unacceptable to Beijing, and that's where I see the root of disagreement following the comments of President Yoon. However, I think that the comparison is valid because the special relationship that Taiwan and China have is in anything but its name effectively functioning as a special relationship between two sovereign states.
Alfred Lin, what's your view?
Yes, actually, to some extent, I think I will agree with President Yoon because regarding cross-strait relation and the relation between Northern Korea and South Korea, of course, we have many similarity, but actually it's different. For Korea, they actually have accepted the idea of one nation, two countries in international law. They have two sovereign states. But back to Taiwan and mainland China, precisely ROC and the PRC, they actually non the ROC and neither ROC and non the PRC recognize the idea of two Chinas. So they insisted one China constitution, and to Taiwan side, I mean for us, one China is mean the Republic of China. So if we could dealing with those issues peacefully, then of course we can do that on our own. But I agree with President Yoon. If there would be a potential conflict or even war in this region, then actually if a war breaks out in Taiwan Strait, that would be an impact globally. That's not just for Taiwan's own business. So KNT stands for we welcome international society participate about a peaceful relation in this region.
So you do agree that if war broke out, that it wouldn't be an internal affair, that it would be a global affair.
Of course, if we just do the peaceful talk, of course we can do so-called, maybe from PRC side, they prefer so-called one China from world, even we have different interpretation about what is one China. But if you want to do this by force, I think wherever you recognize Taiwan or Republic ROC, the 23 million people living in this land, we have every right to defend ourselves with international society's help.
Andrea Yang, would you like to comment on this?
Yes, I think Korea and Taiwan definitely shares, South Korea and Taiwan definitely share similar history and situation after the end of Second World War. The struggle of the history and the struggle of political issues, security issues in the region is also been going on for decades. Then the fight and the differences between democracy and autocracy, that is the similar political background that Taiwan and South Korea have. Then now we face, after the burst out of Ukraine war, then now the two countries also have the similar security issue back on the table again.
Marcin, would you like to talk? So Andrea mentioned, communism or autocracy versus democracy. Would you like to draw on any other, particular things that we share in terms of this comparison, commonalities? Maybe we could talk about their support from America.
Absolutely. So the international dimension of tensions on the Korean Peninsula and in the Taiwan Strait can be related to the US factor. For instance, the United States would very likely deploy its troops that it has on the ground in both South Korea and Japan in case of contingency, either on the Korean Peninsula or in the Taiwan Strait. But I think that the prospects for managing the relations between the two Koreas and between Taiwan and China also face similar difficulties nowadays. The long period of separation, essentially since the end of the Second World War, has given rise to this development of distinct national identities. In Taiwan, the Taiwanese identity, and then also in the Koreas, especially among younger population, the push towards unification is much less pronounced, given that younger people in the South have a hard time identifying with people in the North as brethren. And we see similar dynamics in the cross-strait context as well, where especially younger people have a higher propensity to identify only as Taiwanese rather than Taiwanese and Chinese.
Alfred, if you would like to comment on unification, because again, this is something that, obviously China wishes to unify with Taiwan, and on the Korean peninsula also there is a desire to unify.
Yes, I think the point is the way of life we have insist here in Taiwan is the democratic constitution. That's constitution of the Republic of China, which is KNT stands for our democracy, our liberty, our freedom of speech, all rely on that constitution. So the KNT stands for that. Defending that constitution, we stand for strengthen our national defense, but also we want to keep a dialogue with mainland China and also to the international society to keep the regional peace and stability. So if PRC or the mainland Chinese people want to do trade, cultural relation, educational relation exchange with Taiwan, that's be welcome. But if you want to mention the political issue more deeply than before, for example, reunification, even by force, I think there will be a concern shared not just by Taiwan, but also for the international society, and that's not acceptable.
Andrea.
Unification is shifting away from the mainstream willingness of the entire Taiwan society. So it is important that we follow President Tsai's 4 commitments, which is a conclusion of most of the Taiwanese people would agree with. So unification at this point is pretty much unthinkable, given China's authoritarian nature and status. So it is important to look into Taiwanese identity issue first before we talk about unification or future independence issues. So at this point, I think the struggle of Taiwan and China's the political issues is far away from talking about unification at any point.
Okay, so we would have the two of you agreeing on that point, it would seem. Okay, we can talk about this a little bit later. Now, to talk about a possible Taiwan contingency and South Korea's role, my next guest is Guermantes Lailari, a retired US Air Force Foreign Area Officer and a Taiwan Fellow at National Chengchi University. I spoke to him earlier about the Washington Declaration signed between the US and South Korea, which Biden said would reinforce extended deterrence and respond to North Korea's advancing nuclear threats. Let's take a look. Guermantes, what was your analysis of the Washington Declaration?
Well, first of all, let's look at the reason behind it. The South Koreans have launched over 100 long-range missiles within the last year plus. Second, they're about to detonate probably their 7th nuclear test. They've also launched missiles over Japan, and all these things make countries around them nervous. So that's the background. So what does it mean? It means this Washington Declaration, what it means is that the U.S. will show more presence of its nuclear weapons near this Korean Peninsula.
To respond to the aggression from North Korea.
Exactly. And so it's a direct messaging to North Korea, and it's also an indirect messaging to the PLA, because that presence also messages China to say, not only are we in the region, but we can reach out and touch you, because the submarine has long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles on it.
So what does that mean for any Taiwan contingency?
Several things. If you listen to Biden's speech, where President Yoon and him were together, one of the key points he said was that this agreement will also concern itself with keeping peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. So it's the first time, really, I think, that the Koreans are realizing that their mission is not just protecting themselves, but they have a purpose in dealing with Taiwan Straits. And I don't think a lot of the government officials really want to do it, but I think if there's a Taiwan Strait crisis, South Korea will definitely be affected. Even at the least level, their economy is going to be completely ruined.
Because of the shipping, the trade.
Exactly.
Routes. So many people are saying that South Korea would not come to Taiwan's aid, because then it leaves South Korea open to an attack from North Korea.
South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan are interconnected. As Prime Minister Abe said, an attack on Taiwan is an attack on Japan. An attack on Taiwan is an attack on South Korea. They're all going to be playing. And I think it's the first acknowledgement, at least on the US side, that the South Koreans have a role. And one of their important roles is they have a submarine fleet, just like the Japanese do. And they could help prevent either a blockade or an invasion of Taiwan. That is, to me, the most important key role that they could play, the underwater war.
So you're saying that with Biden saying that South Korea will have a role in maintaining peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, that this means that they will have an active role in helping defend Taiwan? I
believe so, especially through their submarines. Japan also has lots of submarines, and so this will deter the PLA, especially in the marine environment. Their ships are vulnerable. So if there's Japanese, South Korean, and U.S. submarines near or in the Taiwan Strait, that puts all their ships at risk. And I would also point out that in terms of Taiwan can support a South Korean crisis, Taiwan can also monitor the strait and also can provide information and intelligence that would be useful to South Korea.
In the event of an attack from North Korea.
Correct.
And very finally, what future arrangements do you expect given the Washington Declaration now?
I think this is a beginning of a lot of bilateral agreements, and so I see an enhanced bilateral agreements not only between U.S. and South Korea, but there's talk now of South Korea and Japan having a bilateral relationship. There already are agreements with the British and the Australians with Japan. The French are currently in negotiations with the Japanese. The National Defense Authorization Act that the U.S. has with Taiwan that was passed in December, that's an enhancement. I would also see an enhanced Quad, perhaps adding South Korea to the Quad. Finally, I would think that the AUKUS is a great opportunity for South Korea to join AUKUS as well as Japan.
Okay. Guermantes Lailari, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
That was Guermantes Lailari speaking with me earlier. Taking a broader look at US-Korea ties is my next guest, Sean King, Vice President of Park Strategies and an expert in East Asian affairs. I spoke to him from New York, and I began by asking how significant were Yoon's comments about Taiwan.
Well, for a South Korean president to say that the Taiwan issue is a global issue and not just an issue between the PRC and Taiwan is significant indeed. What it means in concrete terms, I can't really say. But when it comes to rhetoric and outlook, which I think is in touch with where the South Korean public it's quite a shift indeed.
A departure from his predecessor, Moon Jae-in.
And all South Korean presidents. No South Korean president has ever been really vocal on Taiwan. But I think there's such a resistance to the PRC in South Korea today. And I hear that the younger generation in particular is growing sympathetic to Taiwan over issues like marriage equality, internet freedom, and freedom of speech, that there's a changing view in South Korea that's becoming a lot more sympathetic to Taiwan than in years past, left and right.
The South Korean president's trip to Washington this time, what does it say about US-South Korean relations?
I think it shows that while Japan is still our preeminent ally in Asia, South Korea is not far behind as it achieves global pivotal state status. And it shows how important South Korea is to the US outlook on the world and the Indo-Pacific in general. You know, all the stops were pulled out. Only Emmanuel Macron of France has also gotten a state visit since Biden came into office. So it just shows how much Biden prioritizes and values South Korea.
Let's talk about the nuclear subs. So the US is planning to send one to South Korea. It's been 40 years since a nuclear submarine was last docked in South Korea. So how big a deal is it?
I think it's symbolically very significant. Again, we're not deploying nukes, which we took out in 1991 from South Korea. There's been a massive shift in South Korean public opinion in recent years. A majority of South Koreans, from what I hear, now want their own nukes and or the United States to redeploy some of our nukes there. So this is a show of reassurance. They're not going to be permanently stationed. They're in and out just for time being. And we still hold the keys whether or not to fire them, obviously.
And how likely would it be that the US would station its own nukes?
North Korea, which is an ultranationalist, supposedly go-it-alone ethnic Korean state, they pride themselves on managing their own security. They often use in their own peninsular propaganda, North and South, saying that South Korea is a Yankee colony occupied by 28,500 US troops, while the last Chinese People Liberation Army volunteer left North Korea in 1958. And they'll say that South Korea used to have US nukes on its soil, is now going to have nuclear submarines in South Korean ports. Meanwhile, they have their own nukes. North Korea will use this against South Korea in propaganda terms to suggest it is somehow less self-sufficient or less Korean, as it were, than the North is. And we don't want to give North Korea any fuel for its fire to justify its nukes program any further. The fact is, South Korea is protected under the United States nuclear umbrella, and there's no need for us to put nukes back down there. That is just going to increase nukes arms race that nobody needs.
Yoon Suk-Yeol gave a speech to Congress whilst he was in the US. How was that speech received?
And I think a lot of people liked what they heard, him talking about South Korean, Japanese, US trilateral cooperation against North Korea and mainland China. And also his condemnation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine was very well received. But still no word yet on whether or not South Korea is going to arm Ukraine. But again, its laws forbid it from sending arms abroad for other than peaceful purposes. So it require a policy change in South Korea. And right now the opposition controls the assembly. So until further notice, they're going to do things like backfill Polish military coffers as Poland supplies Ukraine. But unless there's a major policy shift in South Korea, made all the more difficult by these allegations that we've been pressuring them behind the scenes on it, I don't expect South Korea to be arming Ukraine directly.
There is a small issue, though, of when Nancy Pelosi, the former House Speaker, visited South Korea after visiting Taiwan, Yoon Suk-Yeol did not see her. So does that throw any doubt on this trilateral security partnership?
His shying away from that one issue on Taiwan, I don't think that's really what ROK, U.S., Japanese trilateral cooperation is all about.
So you don't think that Taiwan is a major component of that?
Well, maybe that's the view on Taiwan itself, but not necessarily. I mean, you would have to think North Korea's nuclear program, South China Sea, Senkaku Islands, those issues are just as important, if not more so, in some cases, depending on how far they go. And I've never expected South Korea to get involved in a Taiwan contingency. And even if our troops wanted to go from South Korea to Taiwan in the case of a PRC attack, that could leave South Korea vulnerable to an attack from the north.
South Korea's First Lady actually held her own event whilst in Washington. So how does this contrast this president with his predecessor?
Yeah, South Korean First Lady Kim Kun-hee held her own North Korean human rights event where she met North Korean defectors and the mother of Otto Warmbier, the American student sent back in a vegetative state, effectively murdered by North Korea, who died back home in Ohio. And among the defectors in the audience was my friend, Hyun Sung Lee, defector who came over via China a few years ago. And, you know, Moon Jae-in, Yoon's nationalist left so-called progressive predecessor, shied away from discussing North Korean human rights because he didn't want it to jeopardize or upset his engagement with Kim Jong-un. So in 2019, South Korea actually declined to support a United Nations North Korean human rights resolution. And what we discussed in the nuclear subs is part of the Washington Declaration between Yoon and Biden. And I love that naming because it speaks to the differing priorities of the last two South Korean presidents. Yoon and Biden have the Washington Declaration, and Moon and Kim had the Pyongyang Joint Declaration. So it shows that Yoon is firmly in America's corner and not waiting for North Korea to play nice.
Sean King of Park Strategies. Now, while Sean King doubts South Korea will be sending lethal aid to Ukraine anytime soon, this move would be in keeping with the US and Western alliance, and also with one of Yoon's key messages, that the best deterrence is strength. Marcin, so let's turn back to Taiwan. For Taiwan, is strength the best deterrence?
I have to agree with the words of President Yoon and underline their applicability to the Taiwanese context as well. If we think about deterrence, effective deterrence consists of two main factors. Firstly, credible assurance, and then credible threat. Credible assurance refers to some guarantees to the actor at which deterrence is targeted that they would not be exploited if they stay away from the proscribed course of action. But then we also have the second component, which is credible threat, which has to indicate to the PRC in the case of Taiwan that the cost of unilateral efforts at changing the status quo would be high, and also that there is sufficient political will to really impose that cost. And I think that the greater the strength in terms of military hardware and military software in Taiwan, the greater this cost appears to be. So strength measured by military might is definitely contributing to effective deterrence by enhancing the perceived cost of unilateral changes to the status quo.
Alfred, so let's talk about the ways that Taiwan can build that strength. One of the ways, obviously, is purchasing arms in a military sense. I mean, China would see Taiwan building this strength, buying arms from the US, as a provocation. What's your view on that?
Actually, earlier this morning, I just publicly welcomed the retired U.S. general leading a commercial group about the arms dealer. They are visiting Taiwan right now. We publicly welcome them because we also urge our National Defense Department to talk about the detail about deliver those arms equipment we actually urgently need right now, because we heard some news that those military equipment we have been brought in for a long time already been postponed by some international factor. And also, as a reserve military officer, I actually strong subscribe to the concept about strength is needed to deter, because I personally really love a Latin saying is that CBS Pachum, para velum. That means if you want peace, prepare for war. So for now, we actually understand for the National Army of the ROC or Taiwan's military troops, in both volunteer troops and also reserve force, we lack of basic label, platoon leader, military officer to need to face our military challenge externally. So we urge the government to perform any kind of national defense reform to help to restore our military power, the strength to deter. I think that's actually very urgently our public, general public should be noticed.
Alfred, so is that a view that is shared across the KMT? Because we know from history, from during the Manchu period, Taiwan didn't buy as many arms, and also there have been voices in the KMT who have criticized buying arms as something that might be a provocation.
Well, I would say it's kind of rebalancing about our foreign policy, because during the Manchu's time, we don't need buy the largest arm to defend ourselves. We can efficiently, by dialogue, to maintain the peaceful environment in this region and for the stability with mainland China. But for now, I think the geopolitical environment has been changed than before. We are facing a turbulent time, not just in Indo-Pacific, but all over the world. We saw conflict is ongoing, and we understand right now if Taiwan want to keep the prosperity and thriving democracy in East Asia, we need to strengthen and to put the investment in our national defense.
So since Ukraine?
I think Ukraine and Russian war is an important turning point that reminding Taiwanese people and also many politicians inside KNT, we need to pay more attention to the national defense. And so that's the reason why our new current chairman, Eric Zhu, maintained national defense and also dialogue. There's 2D strategy to strengthen national defense and also dialogue to keep the peace and the stability in this region. Because back to before, like some people's public image for the KNT, we just emphasize dialogue, but maybe not much for defense. But now we have a new geopolitical environment, so also we will rebalancing our foreign policy.
Andrea Yang, so the KMT says that they're focused on dialogue as well as strength.
Yes, I think the best deterrence is strength is definitely valid. However, the strength has to go through preparation. The preparation of the military defense capability, and also the preparation for the societal strength. So this is through a lot of discussion, and never before Taiwan received high attention and discussion from the international society. That's a very significant sign that we need to read through. So it is true that we need to get ready for the worst scenario. Of course, nobody wants a war to happen, but I'm happy to hear that Alfred, in his KMT Young Generation, is also pro strength of Taiwan's military capability. That's very important, that we have the consensus to look for, to secure and safeguard Taiwan as a nation. Then this is through whether armed purchase or to build up our military capability. That includes the Air Force and also maritime military capability. That's very important for the ruling party and the opposition parties to have such consensus. However, there are some KMT legislators do oppose to allocate budgets on the defense category.
So that's currently?
Yes, they mentioned this before. Then they would say something like rather put the budget for social welfare allocations. So that's the certain consensus that both ruling party and opposition party to sit down together and have a proper discussion on on Taiwan's defense future.
Alfred, I'll let you respond to that.
Yes, we read the news about the National Defense Department. They claim there's urgent military equipment we need to approve of this budget. But in fact, our some KMT legislator find out actually the timing and the money inside the budget, they have some questions. So I think they just mentioned a reasonable expectation to help to check and balance for our taxpayers' money, whether they are being using or not in a reasonable national defense budget.
So what was the question that these lawmakers had wanted to find out? What was the check and balance?
Yes, for example, there is an anti-missile missile. The National Defense Department claimed that we need that within the 5 years to prepare for the incoming potential conflict. But for now, we have been informed about, we must postpone those military requirements later to 10 years because many international factors, or maybe, for example, Ukraine-Russia war or other factors, so we need to postpone those budget and missiles. So, of course, we will question why our National Defense Department didn't do the necessary check previously and kind of thing lie for now to our legislator and our taxpayers. So our legislator have the responsibility to understand what's going wrong, what's going on right now, to make it public. I think that's a responsible democratic opposition party should do.
Andrea.
Well, I think the public discussion is focused more on whether Taiwan should have spent money and how the scale of the money on the defense budget. But it's unfortunate that such issue has been translated into that DPP is preparing a war, the upcoming war. So such discussion is creating a chaos and confusion in the society. The lawmakers, they would need to they have problems telling the people and the general population in a more rational and more clear way. So the communication is taking place, and it's taking a lot of time to really convince the society how far Taiwan would go in terms of the military procurement and also the defense capability of Taiwan's for Taiwan in order to build up the strength. The discussion is going on for a little bit too long, and then that sends a message to the international society whether Taiwan is really have the willingness to purchase the military weapons ASAP.
On the point of dialogue, what has the DPP done to open dialogue with the CPP?
It is hard. It is hard for the DPP to push for dialogues. And of course, in the past, if we go back to the South Korea issue, that there were 6-party talks before 2009. It was unfortunate that North Korea withdrew themselves from the talk. But the Ukraine war, that given Xi Jinping's visit to Russia, he also mentioned about dialogues and reopen the communications is important. However, the CCP is shutting down the door to Taiwan for formal political communication. That's something the KMT is claiming that if they would be able to reopen the dialogues, but the dialogues has to be lawful and transparent in many aspects. The KMT politicians, they do show some gestures to Beijing, but it is also important for Beijing to realize and understand that the current ruling party, DPP, and President Tsai is properly and legally elected by the general population. It was an overwhelming vote in 2020. So the lack of respect is difficult to reopen this dialogue. And it was Beijing's decision not to create a proper channel with Taiwan's government. But we urge and we do look forward to a more peaceful and a more rational discussion of Taiwan's and Beijing's common issues. That it is also, if it is also for Taiwanese people's peace of mind, that the communication and also the political discussion would really push for peace and stability. And that's the that's also something that the international society and our democratic partners would like to see.
In January 2024, Taiwan will hold its presidential election. It's a crucial election for both Taiwan and US-China relations, as the current President Tsai Ing-wen must step down after serving 2 terms. The ruling Democratic Progressive Party has named its candidate, current Taiwan Vice President William Lai. Lai described the upcoming presidential election as a choice between democracy and autocracy. Let's take a look. Lai said former President Ma is going back to the One China framework. President Tsai Ing-wen is heading toward the future on the path of democracy. Alfred, is Ma going back to the One China framework?
I think that's a point because we always has been One China Constitution here of the Republic of China. For us, One China is the ROC. Of course, I know the PRC have their own interpretation, but that's the point. We can have each other's interpretation, but let's put the argument aside. We can do something more pragmatic about civil society exchange, about trading, about the younger generation exchanges. Also, this time when President Marcin Jerzewski visiting mainland China, the message he brought and he announced publicly on the mainland soil is that One China is the Republic of China, and we value our democracy. They didn't hiding, and that's very transparent in front of all over the world's media. Yeah, we didn't hide our stand. Even we know PRC and CCP, of course, they are not really agree with our way of life, with our democratic constitution, but we can tolerate each other. That's the point of dialogue. For example, I know the Marcin sitting next to me, he knows better than me about the value of dialogue, about European value. I think from the EU perspective, there are many differences with mainland China, but their leaders, international leaders, their president, their prime minister keep going Beijing. What's the reason? Because they want a dialogue, they want to dealing with the relation with mainland China, even they have many distrust between them, but they have many pragmatic issues to dealing with, right?
But Alfred, there's a big difference there, isn't it? Because the dialogue that the DPP wants with the CCP can only be successful. This is on the CCP terms if, you know, Tsai Ing-wen says that Taiwan and China are both the same country, part of the same country, which is what the KMT says under the 1992 consensus. So it's slightly different to the European capitals, you know, Macron or, you know, Baerbock going across to China. They're not required to say that Germany or France is part of China. But that's a very interesting point, Marcin. You know, from an external point of view, from the outside, you know, how do foreign viewers of this of Taiwan, do they understand the difference between the two main parties?
I think that it is difficult to communicate the current dynamics in the Taiwanese political scene to international audiences, because the truth of the matter is that both the Kuomintang and the Democratic Progressive Party are parties that push for the maintenance of the status quo.
When Marcin Jerzewski went to China, he did say that Taiwan and China are one country. So is this something that is, is when you say that both parties want to maintain the status quo, is this not a contradiction?
I think that the status quo is this term, the idea of status quo, relates to the de facto situation in the Taiwan Strait rather than the de jure situation. And when we talk about Taiwan, and as we try to situate Taiwan in the conversation about international space, making the distinction between de facto and de jure circumstances is extremely important, because as we have discussed today at length, the constitution that is still the law of the land in Taiwan continues to refer to the idea of Republic of China as the sole China. But the reality is that Taiwan and China function as separate entities without formally declaring independence, and this is the crux of the status quo to which I'm referring.
Andrea, so the KMT's position is they can have dialogue with Beijing, and that relations are warmer between the KMT and the CCP. So does this not mean that the cross-strait can be more peaceful?
Of course, we are looking for peaceful solutions, but don't forget that it is China who's deploying missiles and pointing at Taiwan. So Taiwan will never initiate any military actions or use violence against our neighbors. So it is important to realize that the fundamental differences between Taiwan and China's democratic and autocratic systems. The political systems are the fundamental issues of why Taiwan and China doesn't have common ground to start a dialogue at this point. Taiwan is welcome to open ourselves without sacrificing our democratic values and dignity in many aspects. So it is important to note that Taiwan's future, we've mentioned this and emphasized this for many times, can only be decided in accordance of 23 million people's will and their decisions. So what happened in 2014, it was during Marcin Jerzewski's term, there was a sunflower student movement. It was a result of cross-strait dialogues of trades and economic interactions. So we see this. There was a history that happened before, that the dialogues were brought up economic benefits, or what they believe were the economic benefits, but it was rejected by the society as a whole, and the student movement went out of Marcin Jerzewski's control. So you see the anger of the trade agreements between Taiwan and China was not. It cannot be underestimated. So if we want to do this over again, then it would be also a test. We should also understand where the society and where the people would prefer the Taiwanese leaders, including the ruling and opposition leaders, to be more clear about the cross-strait policies and cross-strait propositions. Then we can talk about the reopen dialogues and what sort of dialogues that Taiwanese people need.
Alfred, so we referred to the Sunflower Movement there, and that was indeed, a movement against the fears of economic integration and possibly even further political integration.
Yeah, there's one interesting point here. As for you mentioned, the Sunflower Movement. Once upon a time, Chairwoman Tsai Ing-wen, when she before took the presidential office, she called ECFA the economic cooperation agreement with mainland China is a poison with candy dress. But when she took office, she changed her attitude toward let's keep this ECFA that's good for Taiwan economy. So we always see many paradox and double standard there for our current DPP administration toward mainland China, because they always use our relation with mainland China as a political tool, weaponized to gain political interest inside Taiwan. That's not really healthy for Taiwanese society and of course our economic growth. For in the past few years, many basic grassroots fishermen and farmer and medium to small size enterprise, they are encountering problem with exporting their products to mainland China or the other country. When that issues happen, our DPP administration, because many political reasons, they have no capability to even dealing with the most basic labor affairs with mainland China. They also increasingly damage our economic stability here and for the people's life. For the most basic labor and small enterprise alike, they have to come to KNT because we have ability to dialogue with mainland China. And state by state, earlier this year, we solved many, not every of issue, but state by state, we're trying to one by one to solve those fishermen, those farmers, what they care about their product in exporting to mainland China and other countries, because that's not political, that's economic, that's their daily life. We're trying to dealing with affair pragmatic and not trying to mention or argument or provocation with mainland China about who is the real China. Let's put it aside because we just focus on to improving Taiwanese people's life. I think that's the biggest difference between KNT and DPP.
You know, Europeans are talking about de-risking, so seeking a distancing of their economies from China's.
Of course, in the European context, it will take a while before we hear what the final consensus of the 27 EU member states actually is on the idea of de-risking. But whether we talk about Taiwan and its economic relations with China, or about the European Union and its common foreign and security policy, one thing is clear. Diversification is one of the most effective tools of risk mitigation, and something which is very true about the case of Taiwan is that particularly in the 2000s, Taiwan allowed itself to become overly dependent on the Chinese market. And I think that the case of agricultural producers here is very salient. That's why I believe that initiatives such as the new southbound policy are much needed and very opportune to help Taiwan avoid the risks of putting all eggs in one basket. This is a strategy that is shared across the region and consistent with, for example, the new sovereign policy of the previous administration in South Korea. So once again, diversification is a tool of risk mitigation.